The first thing I remember was the cold. It is not the cold that bites at your skin or makes you shiver, but something deeper that chills me from the inside out. I didn't cry like other children might have, though I was just a boy. There was no warmth to remember, no mother's arms or father's voice to miss. There was only the cold and the voices. The graveyard was my home, and the dead were my family. I was barely old enough to walk when I realized I was different. The graves were ancient, the headstones crumbling and covered in moss, their inscriptions long worn away. Yet I could see the faces behind the names. They spoke to me and taught me things no living person could. Mr. Gray, the oldest, told me I wasn't like them. "You're alive, boy," he said one evening as I sat cross-legged before his grave. His voice was gravely, ancient like the stones that marked the graves, but there was a kindness to it too. I didn't understand what he meant at first. To me, the graveyard was the world. It was where I'd always been. I knew nothing beyond it. The voices in the dark, the flickers of shadow that took shape when the moon was high, were my companions, my family. I didn't know how to be anything else. But that night, as Mr. Gray spoke, I began to feel the weight of what he said. "One day," he continued, his eyes dimming like the fading twilight, "you'll have to leave this place. The world of the living is calling for you." I shivered at the thought. The world of the living? I had heard stories from the other spirits, whispered tales of bustling streets, warm hearths, and bright sunlight. But those were just that, stories. They weren't for me. The graveyard was my sanctuary, my safety. From where I sat, the iron gate that marked the graveyard's edge seemed like an impenetrable wall, sealing me away from whatever existed beyond. The outside world was terrifying in its vastness and unknowable dangers. The dead had told me many things, but it was the things they didn't say that scared me the most. "Why would I leave?" I asked, my voice small, barely breathing. "There's nothing for me out there." Mr. Gray didn't answer right away. His form wavered slightly as if the effort to stay visible was costing him more than usual. "You won't always have a choice," he said finally. "The living and the dead don't mix. Sooner or later, you'll have to choose." I shook my head. I didn't want to choose. The graveyard was the only place I felt safe. The world beyond the gate, the world of the living, was full of unknowns, and I wasn't ready to face them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Over the years, I grew older, but the dead stayed the same. Their faces remained as I'd always known them, frozen in time. Mrs. Wicklow, who taught me how to read from her dusty old book of poems, never aged a day. Neither did Captain Sullivan, who told me tales of the sea, his eyes always glinting with the memory of far-off waves. They were my mentors, my protectors. But no matter how much they tried to teach me, I knew there were limits to what they could give me. They couldn't teach me about the living, not really. On the night of my 13th year, things began to change. I had become accustomed to the routines of the graveyard, the sounds of the wind whistling through the trees, the distant rustle of leaves that seemed to echo like a whisper of something just out of reach. The dead were my friends, and their world was predictable and comforting in its own eerie way. But on that particular night, there was a new presence. It was initially subtle, a faint shimmer at the edge of my vision, like a trick of the moonlight. I felt it before I saw it, a stirring, a tension in the air that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. And then, out of the shadows, a boy stepped forward. Not a ghost, but a boy like me. He was older, maybe 17, with dark eyes and an even darker expression. "You," he said, pointing at me, his voice laced with disdain. "You're not supposed to be here." I stood frozen, unable to find my voice. I had never seen anyone alive in the graveyard besides myself. His presence was unnatural, like a flame flickering in a place where there should only be cold. "You don't belong with the dead," he continued, stepping closer. His eyes bore into mine, and I felt a strange pull, a connection I didn't understand. "Why are you still here?" The spirits who had always been with me whispered their guidance and were silent. Even Mr. Gray, who had always been the first to speak up, was nowhere to be found. The other boy's words echoed in the space where the whispers should have been. I live here," I stammered. "This is my home." "Home?" he scoffed, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "This is no home. It's a prison, and you've been trapped here long enough." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that I was where I was supposed to be. But as I opened my mouth, something stopped me. A memory, or maybe just a feeling, a sense that he was right. I had been hiding in the graveyard, clinging to the safety of the dead because I was too afraid to face the living. He took another step closer, and I felt a chill run through me, colder than any I'd felt in the graveyard. "It's time to leave," he said, his voice softening, almost sympathetic now. "They can't protect you anymore." I glanced around, hoping to see one of the ghosts, any of the familiar faces I had come to rely on. But the graveyard was empty, eerily still. The dead had abandoned me, leaving me alone with this stranger. I can't," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "I don't know how." The boy's eyes softened, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something else in them. Pity, perhaps. "You're not alone," he said. "I'll help you." I didn't trust him. How could I? He was a stranger, and the graveyard had always been my sanctuary. But something deep inside me stirred, a part of me that had been dormant, waiting for this moment. The boy reached out his hand, and I took it after a moment's hesitation. We walked toward the iron gate that had once seemed so impenetrable. As we approached, the shadows seemed to shift, and for the first time in my life, I felt the pull of the world beyond. It wasn't as terrifying as I had imagined, but it wasn't comforting either. It was uncertain. We stopped just before the gate, and the boy turned to me, his expression serious. "Once you step through, there's no going back," he said. "Are you ready?" I looked back at the graveyard, crumbling headstones, and the ancient trees that had been my companions for so long. The voices of the dead were gone, but I could still feel their presence, like a faint echo in the back of my mind. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm ready," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The gate creaked as the boy pushed it open, and we stepped into the world of the living together. The graveyard was behind me now, but I knew it would always be a part of me. The dead had raised me and shaped me into who I was. But now, it was time to face the living and discover who I could become. As we walked away from the graveyard, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the voices of the forgotten. We stepped out of the graveyard together, my hands still in the boy's grip. I had expected the world outside the gate to be dazzling and overwhelming, but it wasn't. It was just quiet. The street before us was empty, the houses dark, their windows reflecting nothing but the dim glow of a distant street lamp. It was the kind of night that made everything seem suspended in time, like the world had paused just for me. The boy, whose name I still didn't know, let go of my hand once we crossed the gate, as if stepping into the world of the living meant I no longer needed his guidance. I wasn't sure I agreed. "What happens now?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. He looked at me, his dark eyes unreadable in the faint light. "Now," he said slowly, "you learn how to live." I waited for him to say more and offer some explanation or guidance, but he just turned and started walking down the street. I hesitated for a moment before following. I had nowhere else to go. The night air was cool, a stark contrast to the graveyard's heavy stillness. I could hear the distant hum of a car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. These sounds were sounds I had heard before, but now they seemed louder and more immediate. For the first time, I felt the world pressing in on me. Not as an observer, but as a participant. The boy led me through the quiet streets, not speaking, not looking back to see if I was following. I didn't need to ask where we were going. Anywhere was new to me. I had no frame of reference for what lay beyond the graveyard's iron gates. Every street, every shadow felt like uncharted territory. Eventually, we stopped in front of a small house at the end of a cul-de-sac. It was unremarkable, its brick walls and narrow windows blending into the suburban monotony. The boy paused, his hand resting on the gate in front of the house. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked uncertain. "This is it," he said, more to himself than to me. I stepped up beside him, glancing at the house. "Is this your home?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pushed open the gate and walked up to the front door. I followed, my steps slower, more hesitant. There was something off about the house that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. It felt empty, but not in the way the graveyard had been empty. This was a different kind of emptiness that seemed to press down on you, making it hard to breathe. He reached for the door handle, but the door swung open before he could turn it. Standing in the doorway was a woman. She was tall, almost unnaturally thin, and her face was pale, too pale, like she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Her eyes were dark and hollow, and the kind of smile didn't reach her eyes when she smiled. "I see you've brought a friend," she said, her voice smooth but with an edge that made me uneasy. The boy didn't respond. He stepped past her into the house, and after a moment I followed, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The inside of the house was as cold and empty as it had felt from the outside. The furniture was old, covered in dust, and the air smelled stale like the windows hadn't been opened in years. I glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. "You must be hungry," the woman said, closing the door behind us. The lock clicking into place sent a shiver down my spine. "I'm not," I said quickly, my voice sounding small in the silent house. "Nonsense," she replied, her smile growing wider. "A boy your age needs to eat." The boy who had brought me here still hadn't said a word. He stood in the middle of the room, staring at the floor as if trying to disappear into the shadows. Then I realized something I hadn't noticed before. He was afraid. I stepped back, my eyes darting between him and the woman. I should go," I said, turning toward the door. But before I could take another step, the woman moved. She was in front of me in an instant, faster than I thought possible, her hand on my shoulder, her grip like iron. "Stay," she said, her voice as cold as the air around us. "There's no need to be afraid." But I was afraid. I was terrified. The boy finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time since we had entered the house. There was something in his gaze, something that made my stomach drop. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Before I could ask what he meant, the room around me seemed to shift. The walls began to close in, the air growing thick and heavy. The shadows in the room's corners twisted, lengthening, reaching out toward me. And then, out of the darkness, came the voices. At first, they were faint whispers, like the ones I had heard in the graveyard, but these were different. They were angry and accusing, as if I had disturbed something that had been waiting for centuries to be left alone. I tried to pull away from the woman's grip, but she held me fast, her smile never wavering. "You don't belong here," the voices hissed. "You're not one of us." The boy stepped back, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "I didn't know," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't know it would be like this." The shadows grew darker and thicker, wrapping around my legs and arms and pulling me down onto the floor. The cold I had felt in the graveyard was nothing compared to this. This was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, into your soul. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows were suffocating me, dragging me into the darkness. And then, just before everything went black, I heard the woman's voice, soft and mocking. "Welcome home." I woke up in the dark. For a moment, I thought I was back in the graveyard, surrounded by the comforting silence of the dead. But this darkness was different. It was thick, oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, sluggish. My head was pounding, and when I opened my eyes, all I could see was black. I wasn't in the house anymore. I wasn't anywhere I recognized. Panic began to rise in my chest. I was trapped. I didn't know where I was or how I had gotten there, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone. The voices were still there, whispering in the dark, growing louder with every passing second. "You don't belong here," they repeated over and over. "You're not one of us." I tried to speak, to call out for help, but my throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. All I could do was listen as the voices closed in, surrounding me, filling my mind with their anger, their resentment. I wasn't supposed to be here. I had crossed a line and entered a world that wasn't mine, and now I was paying the price. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I forced myself to stand with every ounce of strength I had left. My legs shook beneath me, but I refused to fall. I didn't know where I was or how to escape, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stay here. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The voices grew louder, but I ignored them, focusing on the ground beneath my feet, the feel of the air on my skin. I was alive. I wasn't one of them, and I wouldn't let them take me. Another step, then another. The darkness pressed in on me, but I kept moving, my eyes searching for any sign of light, any way out. And then, Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. A faint glow, barely visible in the distance, but it was there. It was real. I stumbled toward it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body trembling with exhaustion. The voices were screaming now, desperate, furious. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The light grew brighter as I got closer, and I could feel the shadows retreating, the weight lifting from my shoulders. I was almost there, almost free. With one final burst of energy, I reached out toward the light, my fingers brushing against its warmth. And then, everything went white. I woke up again, but this time the darkness was gone. I was lying on the ground, the cool grass beneath me, the scent of earth and leaves filling the air. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the soft glow of the moonlight filtering through the trees. I was back in the graveyard. I lay there for a moment, staring up at the familiar sky, the stars twinkling faintly between the skeletal branches of the ancient trees. The cold grass beneath me felt like a balm, soothing my skin after the oppressive weight of the shadows. The moonlight was soft, its glow delicate and comforting, so different from the harsh, biting light of the house. I wasn't sure how I had made it back. 1 minute, I had been swallowed by that suffocating darkness, and the next, I was lying in the graveyard's center. It was as if the dead had pulled me back, reclaiming me from the world of the living. I sat up slowly, every muscle aching like I had been running for days. The fog of exhaustion clouded my thoughts, but one thing was clear: I wasn't safe anymore, not in the way I had always been. The dead could no longer protect me. The boy from before was nowhere to be found, nor was the woman. I glanced around, half expecting to see their figures lurking in the shadows, but the graveyard was as empty as it had always been. Silent, peaceful. Yet, there was a new weight to that silence now, a tension that I couldn't shake. Mr. Gray's grave was nearby, his headstone barely visible in the darkness. I made my way over, hoping for the comfort of his voice, the steady reassurance that had always grounded me. But as I stood before his grave, the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. There was no voice, no whispering from the dead. For the first time, the spirits were silent. I knelt beside the headstone, running my fingers over the weathered stone, the inscription barely legible. "Mr. Gray?" I called out, my voice hoarse. "Are you there?" Nothing. The cold, familiar comfort of the graveyard felt hollow now, and a sharp pang of fear twisted in my chest. Had I done something wrong, and had my venture beyond the gate severed my connection to this place? "Mr. Gray!" I shouted, louder this time, my voice echoing across the still graveyard. "Please!" But no matter how often I called, I still waited for someone to answer. It was as though the graveyard had turned its back on me, leaving me truly alone for the first time. A shiver ran down my spine, but not from the cold. The world felt different now, darker. I wrapped my arms around myself, pushing back the rising panic. I had to think, had to understand what was happening. I was raised by the dead, surrounded by their wisdom and protection. They had always been there for me. Why weren't they now? I stumbled to my feet, the ache in my body nearly unbearable. The weight of the shadows from that house still clung to me, a reminder of the danger that lurked beyond the iron gates. But something else gnawed at me, something more disturbing than the silence of the dead. The boy, the one who had led me out of the graveyard. He had seemed so certain, so confident in his words. And yet, the fear in his eyes when we reached that house, the way he had trembled in front of the woman, didn't add up. Who was he? Why had he brought me there? I needed answers, and there was only one place I knew to get them: the mausoleum. It was the oldest part of the graveyard, where the whispers were loudest, where the dead were more than just shadows. It was where Mr. Gray had first told me about the others, the spirits who didn't belong to this world, the ones who lurked at the edges of life and death, waiting for their chance to claim what they could. I had always avoided it. The mausoleum was a place of secrets, of things the dead rarely spoke of, but now it seemed like my only option. The path leading to the mausoleum was overgrown, the weeds and brambles thickening with each step. The air grew colder the closer I got, the shadows lengthening, stretching toward me like skeletal fingers. But I kept walking, even as my heart pounded, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the mausoleum, the stone structure loomed before me, its heavy iron door half open, creaking slightly in the breeze. I hesitated for a moment, my hand resting on the cold metal. I had never gone inside before. Mr. Gray had always warned me that some places in the graveyard were not meant for the living, but I wasn't sure I had a choice anymore. Pushing the door open, I stepped into the mausoleum. The air inside was thick and heavy, scenting decay and dust. The walls were lined with stone shelves, each holding the remains of someone long forgotten. But it wasn't the bones that caught my attention, but the silence. A silence so complete it was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I walked deeper into the mausoleum, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The air grew colder with each step, my breath forming small clouds before me. And then, at the far end of the chamber, I saw it. A figure standing in the shadows. At first, I thought it was another ghost, another one of the dead who had come to greet me. But as I got closer, I realized it was the same boy who had led me out of the graveyard and taken me to that house. He stood there, his back to me, his head bowed. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice echoing in the chamber. He didn't turn around, didn't even acknowledge my presence. I took a step closer. "Why did you bring me to that house? What was that place?" Still, he said nothing. Frustration boiled up inside me, mixing with the fear gnawing at me since I left the house. "Answer me!" I shouted, my voice bouncing off the stone walls. Slowly, he turned to face me, and when he did, I felt a chill run down my spine. His face was pale, even more so than before, his eyes dark and hollow, just like the woman's had been. But it wasn't the way he looked that terrified me. It was the expression on his face. The sorrow, the regret, the guilt. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the cold air. "I didn't know what she was." My stomach twisted. "Who? The woman?" He nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. "She promised me, she said she could make me like you. Alive." My breath caught in my throat. "What are you talking about?" "I was never alive," he said, his voice cracking. "Not like you. I'm just a shadow. I thought she could make me real." The weight of his words hit me like a ton of bricks. He wasn't like me. He had never been like me. He wasn't a boy, not really. He was one of the dead, one of the forgotten souls that haunted the edges of the graveyard. "And the house?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "She lives there," he said, his eyes filling with tears. "She takes the living, uses them to make herself stronger. I didn't know, I swear. I just wanted to be like you." I took a step back, my heart racing. "She wanted to use me?" He nodded, his face twisted in anguish. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen." Fear gripped me, colder than the air around us. The woman, whatever she was, had wanted something from me, something I didn't understand or wasn't sure I wanted to know. And this boy, this ghost, had been the one to lead me to her. "I have to leave," I said, turning toward the door. "I can't stay here." The boy didn't stop me. He stood there, his head bowed, as I fled from the mausoleum into the cold night air. But as I ran, I realized something terrible. There was nowhere left for me to go. As I stumbled back toward the main part of the graveyard, the weight of everything the boy had told me settled like a stone in my chest. I had thought the graveyard was my sanctuary, my safe haven from the world of the living. But now, I wasn't sure if anywhere was safe. The woman had found me, and if she wanted me, there was no reason she couldn't come again. I reached Mr. Poor Gray's grave and collapsed onto the ground, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The silence of the graveyard pressed in around me, but this time it wasn't comforting. It was oppressive and stifling. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Help me." But no one answered. For the first time in my life, I was truly alone. I don't know how long I sat there in the cold, staring at Mr. Gray's grave, waiting for anything to happen. I had never felt so helpless, so small. The dead had always been there for me, their voices a constant in my life, a reminder that I wasn't alone. But now, the silence weighed on me like a curse. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual, creeping toward me as if they were alive, their inky darkness wrapping around my ankles. A shiver ran down my spine, and I pulled my knees to my chest, trying to shake the cold that had settled deep in my bones. I had always known that the dead could be dangerous, that the graveyard held secrets far darker than the whispers of the spirits. But I had never felt afraid here. Not like this. Not until I realized that I wasn't protected anymore. And then I heard it. A soft rustling, like the sound of leaves being dragged across the ground by the wind. But there was no wind. The air was still thick with the scent of earth and decay. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I strained to listen. This time, the sound came closer, followed by a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the dark. But then I heard it clearly, a distant and hollow voice calling my name. Samuel. I jolted to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't heard anyone call my name like that in years, not since the day I first stepped foot in the graveyard. The spirits had always called me by other names, boy or child, but never my real name. They had always seemed to know that I wasn't like them. Samuel. The voice was closer now, and I turned, searching the darkness for the source. But there was nothing, just the headstones, the trees, and the endless shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, just the same soft rustling, the same whispers growing louder, more insistent. And then, out of my eye, I saw movement, something flickering at the edge of the graveyard, near the old stone wall, separating this world from the next. I stepped toward it, my heart racing. Every instinct told me to run, to get as far away from the graveyard as possible. But something pulled me forward, something I couldn't explain. The closer I got, the clearer the whispers became, and with them came a sense of familiarity, like a long-forgotten memory rising to the surface. And then I saw her. She stood by the wall, her figure barely visible in the dim light. Her long hair flowed around her like a river of darkness, her pale skin almost glowing in the shadows. But it wasn't her appearance that stopped my heart. It was her eyes. They were the same eyes I had seen in the mirror every day. She smiled, a small, sad smile, and took a step toward me. "Samuel," she whispered again, her voice soft, almost pleading. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. My feet felt rooted to the ground, my body frozen in place. I knew her, somehow, I knew her. But it wasn't possible. She couldn't be real. She couldn't be standing here in the graveyard. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice as soft as the wind. "This place isn't for you." I shook my head, my mind spinning. Who are you?" She smiled again, a sad, knowing smile. "I'm your mother." The words hit me like a punch to the chest, knocking the breath from my lungs. My mother? No, it couldn't be. She was dead. She had been dead for as long as I could remember. But as I stared at her, something in my mind shifted, like a puzzle piece falling into place. Memories I had long buried rose to the surface. Memories of her face, voice, and hands holding mine. I had forgotten so much, but now, standing in the graveyard, it all came rushing back. "I've been waiting for you," she said, stepping closer. "I've been waiting for so long." I took a step back, my heart racing. This isn't real," I whispered. "You're not real." Her expression softened, her eyes filled with sadness. "I'm as real as you are, Samuel. You've been lost for so long, but it's time to come home." Home. The word echoed in my mind, tugging at something deep inside me. The graveyard had always been my home, or so I had thought. But now, standing in front of this woman who claimed to be my mother, I wasn't so sure. Everything I had known, everything I had believed, seemed to unravel around me. "I can't," I said, shaking my head. "I can't leave." "You can," she whispered, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't belong here, Samuel. You never did." Tears stung my eyes, blurring my vision. "But the graveyard, it's all I've ever known." She reached out, her fingers brushing against my cheek, cool and soft. "I know," she said, "but there's more to the world than this place. There's more to life than the dead." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to reach out, to take her hand and let her lead me away from the graveyard, the cold and the silence. But something held me back, something deep inside me that had been there for as long as I could remember. "I don't know how," I whispered, my voice breaking. She smiled, a sad, tender smile. "You don't have to know. You just have to trust me." Trust. The word felt foreign in my mouth, like something I hadn't spoken in years. I had trusted the dead, trusted their guidance, their protection. But now I wasn't sure who to trust. Before I could say anything else, a cold wind swept through the graveyard, stirring the leaves and sending a shiver down my spine. The shadows shifted, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the darkness, something watching. I turned to look, my heart pounding, and then I saw him. The boy from the house. He was standing near the edge of the graveyard, his eyes wide with fear, his face pale in the moonlight. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, as if he was trying to warn me of something I couldn't see. "Samuel," my mother's voice broke through the silence, pulling my attention back to her. "It's time to go." I hesitated, my heart torn between two worlds. The boy stood frozen, his eyes locked on mine, silently pleading with me. And then I realized, he wasn't just afraid, he was terrified. "I can't," I whispered, stepping back from my mother. "I can't go with you." Her smile faltered, her eyes darkening. "Samuel, you don't understand. If you stay here, you'll never be free." I shook my head, the fear rising in my chest. "No, I belong here. This is my home." Her expression twisted, and the sadness in her eyes was replaced by something darker, something cold. "You belong with me," she said, her voice low and sharp. "You always have." The shadows around her began to shift, swirling like smoke, and for the first time I felt the true weight of her presence. She wasn't my mother. She had never been. The boy took a step toward me, his eyes wide with terror. "Run," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You have to run." I didn't wait for her to speak again. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the ground as I raced toward the center of the graveyard. The cold air whipped at my face, the shadows stretching and twisting around me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Behind me, I heard her voice, no longer soft and gentle, but harsh and furious. "You can't escape, Samuel," she shouted, echoing through the graveyard. "You belong to me." I didn't look back. I couldn't. My heart raced, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed myself harder, faster. The trees blurred past me, the headstones nothing more than dark shapes in the night. And then, just when I thought my legs would give out, I saw it, the iron gate. It loomed ahead of me, its bars dark and foreboding, but it was my only chance. I sprinted toward it, my body screaming in protest, my lungs burning with every breath. But as I reached the gate, something caught my foot, sending me sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through my leg, and I cried out, my hands scrambling to push myself up. Behind me, I heard her laugh, cold and cruel. "You can't leave," she said, her voice closer now, filled with malice. "You can never leave." I looked up, my vision swimming as I reached for the gate. My fingers brushed against the cold metal, and for a moment, I thought I might make it. But then the shadows closed around me, pulling me back into the darkness. The shadows wrapped around my legs like chains, dragging me down. I clawed at the dirt, my nails scraping against the cold ground, but it was useless. The gate, once so close, now felt impossibly far away. The air around me thickened, making breathing hard, and my vision blurred. Once familiar and gentle, the whispers of the dead had turned into an angry chorus, hissing my name like a curse. "Samuel," the voice called again. My mother's voice, though I knew now it was a lie. "Come back. You can't run from me. You belong to me." I tried to pull myself up and reach for the gate, but the shadows were too strong. They were pulling me deeper into the ground, into the darkness that seemed to open beneath me like a grave. Panic surged through me, and I struggled harder, kicking at the shadows, but it only made them tighten their grip. And then, out of my eye, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was just the wind or another trick of the shadows, but then I heard a voice, faint and distant but unmistakable. "Hold on." I turned my head, my heart pounding, and saw him, the boy. He was standing just beyond the shadows, his face pale and gaunt, but his eyes were burning with determination. He wasn't running this time. He was coming toward me. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaking. "I didn't know. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was watch as he reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the shadows pulling me under. The moment his fingers made contact, the shadows recoiled as if burned. They hissed and writhed, loosening their grip on my legs just enough for me to move. I gasped for air, the weight lifting from my chest, and with all the strength I had left, I pulled myself toward the gate. The boy knelt beside me, his face twisted with guilt and fear. "You have to go," he whispered urgently. "You can't stay here." I can't," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. She won't let me go." "She has no power over you," he said, his eyes wide. "Not anymore." I shook my head, my mind spinning. "I don't understand." The boy's grip on my arm tightened, his face filled with a strange urgency. "She's not your mother. She's not even alive. She's been trapped here, feeding on the living, using their memories to make herself stronger." I blinked, the words barely registering. Then, who am I? You're Samuel, he said firmly, as if it was the most important thing in the world. You were always Samuel. The shadows surged forward again, lashing out at the boy, but he didn't flinch this time. He stood his ground, his eyes burning with defiance. She can't have you. You're not hers. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that I could leave and escape this place and the darkness that had claimed so much of me. But the whispers were still there, pulling at the edges of my mind, telling me that I belonged here and would never be free. She's lying, the boy said, his voice rising above the whispers. You don't belong to her. You never did. The shadows lunged at him, but he didn't move. Instead, he grabbed my hand, pulling me to my feet. Run, he shouted. I didn't hesitate. With all my strength, I bolted toward the gate, the boy right behind me. The shadows screamed in fury, lashing out in all directions, but they couldn't touch us. Not anymore. As we reached the gate, I felt the air around me change. It was no longer cold, no longer suffocating. The weight pressing down on me since I entered the graveyard lifted, and I could breathe for the first time in what felt like forever. We burst through the gate, stumbling onto the street beyond. The boy collapsed beside me, gasping for breath, but there was no time to stop. The shadows were still behind us, still reaching for us, but they couldn't cross the gate. I turned, my heart racing, and saw the dark tendrils of shadow writhing and hissing like serpents just beyond the iron bars. They couldn't leave the graveyard. They were trapped. For a moment, I couldn't believe it. We were safe. I fell to my knees, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The boy was beside me, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes were clear, no longer clouded with fear. We made it, he whispered, as if he couldn't quite believe it. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. We had made it. We were free. But the relief was short-lived. The footsteps echoed down the empty street, slow and deliberate, and my heart sank. I didn't have to turn to know who it was. She's coming, the boy whispered, his voice filled with dread. I turned, and there she was, my mother, or the thing that had pretended to be her. She was standing just beyond the gate, her face twisted with fury, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. You can't leave me, Samuel, she hissed, her voice sharp as a blade. You belong to me. The boy grabbed my arm, his grip tight. Don't listen to her, he whispered urgently. She's lying. You don't belong to anyone. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to turn away, to run, but her eyes held me in place, locking me in a way the shadows never could. You're mine, Samuel, she said, her voice softer now, almost gentle. Come back to me. My heart twisted in my chest. For a brief moment, I wanted to step toward her, wanted to believe that she could be my mother, that I could go back to the way things were before. But then I saw her eyes, those cold, dead eyes, and I knew the truth. She wasn't my mother. She had never been. I took a step back, my legs shaking. No, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Her face twisted in rage, her form shifting, becoming less human, more monstrous. You can't escape me, she screamed, her voice echoing through the night. I'll never let you go. The boy pulled me back, his eyes wide with terror. Run, he shouted. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Something inside me had shifted, something that had been asleep for so long. I wasn't running anymore. Not this time. You don't control me, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. You never did. Her eyes blazed with fury, and the shadows surged toward us, crashing against the gate like a wave. But they couldn't touch me. Not anymore. I don't belong to you, I said, my voice steady. I never did. And then, with a final scream of rage, she vanished. The shadows dissolved into the night, and the graveyard fell silent again. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the space where she had been. The boy was beside me, his hand still gripping my arm, his face pale and drawn. You did it, he whispered, his voice filled with awe. You're free. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The weight that had pressed down on me for so long was gone, but there was still an emptiness inside me, a hollow place where my fear had once been. What happens now? I asked, my voice quiet. The boy looked up at the sky, the first light of dawn beginning to break over the horizon. I don't know, he said, his voice soft. But whatever it is, you won't have to face it alone. I turned to him, my heart swelling with gratitude. He had saved me, had risked everything to help me escape the darkness that had claimed me for so long. I owed him more than I could ever repay. I never got your name, I said, offering him a small smile. He hesitated for a moment, then smiled back. Thomas, he said. My name is Thomas. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me. Thank you, Thomas. He grinned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I guess we both got out, didn't we? I smiled, though my heart was heavy. Yeah, we did. We stood there momentarily, watching the sun rise over the horizon, the light chasing away the last remnants of the night. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Whatever it was, I would face it. And this time, I wasn't alone. The sunrise spread its golden light across the sky, and the world seemed to exhale as if it had been holding its breath all night. I stood next to Thomas, my legs trembling from the run, my mind spinning with everything that had happened. The graveyard, the shadows, the creature that had pretended to be my mother felt distant now, like a nightmare slowly fading with the dawn. But I realized something as the light of day chased away the darkness. I was free from the graveyard, but I was also lost. The cemetery had been my entire world for as long as I could remember. I didn't know what lay beyond its gates, and the idea of finding out filled me with a strange mixture of excitement and dread. What now? I asked again, my voice quiet as I watched the sun creep higher in the sky. Thomas stood beside me, his face bathed in the warm glow of the morning light. He looked different now, less like a shadow and more like a real person. There was color in his cheeks, and his eyes, once dark and hollow, seemed to sparkle with life. I don't know, he said, his voice as unsure as mine, but we're not going back there, that's for sure. I nodded. The graveyard, crumbling tombstones and whispering dead, felt like a lifetime ago. It had been my home, but it wasn't where I belonged, not anymore. What about you? I asked, turning to Thomas. What will you do now? He hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the graveyard behind us. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his gaze, a trace of the boy I had first met, who had been as trapped as I was. But then he smiled a real smile, and the shadows faded. I don't know, he said, but whatever it is, it'll be better than staying in that place. I smiled, but deep down, I felt a pang of guilt. Thomas had been caught in the same trap as me, but unlike me, he had been a part of the graveyard for so much longer. He had helped me escape, but what about him? What would happen to him now? Before I could ask, Thomas straightened up, eyes scanning the quiet street. We should get moving, he said. It's not safe to linger. I didn't argue. The graveyard might have released us, but I didn't want to test its boundaries after what had happened. We started walking down the street, away from the gate and the past. The world beyond the graveyard was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The houses we passed were old, their windows dark and empty, as if the people who lived there had long since forgotten the concept of time. The air was still, the morning mist clinging to the ground like a blanket. For the first time in my life, I was walking through the world of the living, yet it felt as ghostly as the graveyard. Thomas didn't say much as we walked. His silence was comfortable, though, not the suffocating kind I had come to fear. I glanced at him several times, wondering if he was thinking the same things I was, and if he felt unmoored. Eventually, we reached the edge of town. The houses gave way to open fields, the road stretching before us like a ribbon of possibility. I stopped, staring at the horizon, the vastness of it all making my chest tighten. Where do we go now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Thomas stopped beside me, his hands in his pockets as he looked at the same horizon. Anywhere, he said after a moment. We're free now. We can go wherever we want. Anywhere. It sounded so simple, so easy. But the truth was, I didn't know where I wanted to go. The world was wide, and I had never known anything beyond the graveyard's iron gates. I had no memories of a life before that place, no family, no home. I was as much a ghost as the spirits who had raised me. Thomas seemed to sense my hesitation and turned to me with a small smile. You're not alone, Samuel, he said, his voice gentle. We'll figure it out together. I looked at him, at the boy who had once been as lost as I was, and felt a warmth spread through my chest. I wasn't alone, not anymore. We started walking again, this time with no destination in mind. The road stretched out before us, empty and open, and for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. There was a whole world out there, beyond the graveyard, beyond the shadows, And even though I didn't know what awaited us, I knew one thing for sure. I was ready to find out. We walked for hours, the sun rising higher in the sky, warming our skin as the cool morning gave way to the day's heat. The fields around us were quiet, and the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of wind in the grass were the only sounds breaking the silence. It felt strange, walking through the world of the living, with no whispers in the air, no eyes watching me from the shadows. For so long I had been surrounded by the dead, their voices a constant presence in my mind. Now, without them, the world felt different, lighter, or emptier. I wasn't sure which. Thomas was quiet beside me, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He seemed more at ease now, more real, as if the further we got from the graveyard, the more solid he became. I wondered if he felt the same strange emptiness I did, or was just relieved to be free. Eventually, the road led us to a small town, its streets quiet in the mid-morning sun. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, the kind of place where strangers stuck out like sore thumbs. I hesitated at the edge of town, unsure of how to proceed. I had never been in a place like this before. I had never had to interact with people or with the living. Thomas noticed my hesitation and gave me a reassuring smile. "We'll be fine," he said. "Just act natural." I nodded, though my heart was racing. Act natural, sure, no big deal. Just pretend I hadn't spent my entire life in a graveyard surrounded by ghosts. Easy. We walked down the main street, our footsteps echoing off the cobblestone. The town was small but charming in a way I hadn't expected. Flower boxes were in the windows, and the smell of freshly baked bread wafted from a bakery nearby. It was peaceful, normal, the kind of place I had only ever heard about in stories. A few people glanced at us as we passed, their expressions curious but not unfriendly. I kept my head down, hoping to avoid awkward questions. I wasn't ready to explain who I was or where I had come from. Not yet. Thomas seemed more comfortable than I was, his posture relaxed as we walked through the town. He didn't seem bothered by the stares or by the fact that we didn't belong here. He was confident, even in the face of the unknown. I envied that about him. We stopped outside a small cafe, the smell of coffee and pastries drifting through the open door. My stomach rumbled, and I realized just how long it had been since I had eaten. The dead didn't need food, but I was starting to remember that I did. "Want to grab something to eat?" Thomas asked, his eyes twinkling with amusement at my growling stomach. I hesitated, glancing at the cafe. I don't have any money," Thomas shrugged. "Neither do I, but we can figure something out." I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but he was already heading inside before I could ask. I followed him, my heart pounding as we entered the warm, inviting space. The cafe was small, with a handful of tables and a counter displaying rows of pastries and baked goods. A woman stood behind the counter, her smile warm and welcoming as we approached. "What can I get for you boys?" she asked, her voice friendly. Thomas glanced at me, then back at the woman. "Two of whatever's freshest," he said, flashing her a grin that seemed to disarm her immediately. She laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Coming right up." I stood awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot, unsure of what to do. Thomas, on the other hand, seemed entirely at ease. I couldn't understand how he could be so calm, so confident. We didn't belong here, not really. But he acted like we did, like we were just two ordinary boys grabbing breakfast at a cafe. The woman handed us two pastries, still warm from the oven, and Thomas thanked her before leading me to a table near the window. I sat down, my heart still racing, but the smell of the food was too good to resist. I took a bite, and the sweetness exploded on my tongue, filling me with a warmth I hadn't realized I was missing. "This is incredible," I muttered through a mouthful of pastry. Thomas laughed. "Told you." For a moment, everything felt normal. We were just two boys, sitting in a cafe, eating breakfast. The shadows, the graveyard, and the whispers of the dead seemed so far away, like they belonged to another world. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The graveyard was still a part of me, and it always would be. The dead had raised me, after all. No matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape that. We sat in the cafe for a while, the warm sun streaming through the windows, casting a golden glow across the small room. The chatter of the few other patrons was a low hum in the background, and for a moment it felt like we were part of the normal world, part of something alive and real. But even as I finished the last bite of my pastry, that nagging feeling in my stomach wouldn't leave. No matter how much I wanted to pretend, I knew we didn't belong here. I didn't belong here. Thomas seemed to sense my unease. He sat across from me, leaning back in his chair with an easy confidence that I envied, but his eyes were sharper now, more watchful. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" he asked quietly. I looked up at him, confused. "Thinking about what?" "The graveyard, the shadows, everything you left behind." I swallowed hard, suddenly feeling exposed. He was right, of course. I was thinking about it, about her, about the thing that had pretended to be my mother, about the way the shadows had reached for me, even after I had escaped. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. "Yeah," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't stop thinking about it." Thomas nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "It's hard to leave a place like that behind. It gets into your bones." I stared at him for a long moment, the words sinking in. "Is it always like this?" I asked. "Do you ever stop feeling it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced out the window, watching the people pass by on the street outside. His expression darkened, and when he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "I wish I could tell you that it gets easier," he said, "but it doesn't. The graveyard, the dead, they stay with you. They always stay with you." The weight of his words settled heavily on my chest. Deep down, I knew that I could never truly escape the graveyard. It had been my home for too long, and the spirits that had raised me were a part of me. No matter how far I ran or how hard I tried to leave it behind, the graveyard would follow. Thomas must have seen the look on my face because he leaned forward, his eyes serious. "But you can still live, Samuel. You don't have to go back. You don't have to let it control you." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that I could live in this world and be like the people outside, walking through the streets without a care. But the truth was, I wasn't like them. I had been raised by the dead. I had seen and felt things that no one else would ever understand. How could I live in a world that didn't know the weight of shadows? Before I could answer, the door to the cafe creaked open, and a chill swept through the room. I looked up, my heart skipping a beat, half expecting to see the shadows crawling in behind us. But it wasn't the shadows. It was a man. He was tall and gaunt, his skin pale as the moon, his eyes dark and sunken. He wore an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd see in pictures from another century, and there was something about the way he moved that sent a shiver down my spine. He walked slowly, deliberately, his gaze sweeping over the room. For a moment, I thought he hadn't noticed us, but then his eyes locked on mine, and I felt a jolt of recognition, though I had never seen him before. Thomas went still beside me, his body tense, his hands gripping the table's edge. He leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to leave, now." I glanced at him, confused. "Who is that?" "Not here," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to go. Come on." Before I could ask any more questions, Thomas was already on his feet, pulling me up with him. We left our plates and cups behind, heading for the door as quickly as possible without drawing attention. But the man was watching us. I could feel his eyes on my back as we stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. Thomas didn't stop. He kept walking, his pace quick and purposeful. I followed him, my heart racing, a sense of dread settling over me like a thick fog. "Who was that?" I asked again, my voice shaking. Thomas didn't answer right away. He kept walking, his eyes scanning the street as if looking for something, someone. Finally, after what felt like forever, he spoke. "He's a collector." "A collector?" I repeated, confused. "What does that mean?" Thomas slowed, glancing over his shoulder to ensure the man wasn't following us. When he was satisfied that we were safe, at least for the moment, he turned to face me. "There are people in this world," he said quietly, "people who collect things that shouldn't exist. Things like you and me." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Like ghosts?" Thomas shook his head. "Not exactly, but close enough. They're interested in things that don't belong. People who have crossed the line between life and death." I stared at him, the words sinking in. "You mean he wants to collect us?" Thomas nodded grimly. "He wants to take you back to the graveyard." My heart skipped a beat. "Why? What does he want with me?" Thomas's expression darkened. "He wants you because you escaped, because you're not supposed to be here. The dead, they have rules, and you broke them." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I had never thought of it like that, of the graveyard as a place with rules that could keep me even after I had left. But now, standing in the middle of the street with Thomas beside me, I realized the truth. I hadn't just escaped the graveyard. I had broken free from something much bigger, something much more dangerous. And now, it was coming for me. "We have to keep moving," Thomas said, his voice tense. "He won't stop. He'll keep coming until he gets what he wants." I nodded, fear tightening in my chest. "Where do we go?" Thomas hesitated, his gaze flicking down the street. "I know a place, somewhere he can't follow." I didn't ask any more questions. I trusted Thomas. He had gotten me this far, after all. And now, with a collector on our trail, I had no choice but to trust him again. We started walking faster this time, our footsteps echoing on the empty street. The town around us seemed to blur, the houses and shops fading into the background as we moved. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that at any moment the man would step out of the shadows and take me back to the place I had fought so hard to leave. But as we walked, something else began to stir in my mind, something darker, more dangerous. The whispers of the dead, the voices I had thought I had left behind, began to creep back into my thoughts. They were faint at first, just a soft hum at the edge of my consciousness, but as we moved further from the town, they grew louder, more insistent. They called my name repeatedly, like a chant I couldn't ignore. "Samuel, Samuel." I tried to shake them off and focus on the road ahead, but it was useless. The voices were everywhere, filling my mind and drowning out everything else. "Samuel, come back." I stumbled, my vision blurring, my head spinning. Thomas caught my arm, steadying me, but I could barely hear him over the voices. "Samuel," he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "Stay with me." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I could. The voices pulled at me, tugging me back toward the graveyard and the shadows. And then, just as quickly as they had come, the voices stopped. I blinked, the world snapping back into focus. We stood at the edge of a forest, the trees towering above us, their branches twisting together like a web. The air was colder and thicker here, and I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. "This is it," Thomas said, his voice quiet. I stared at the forest, my heart pounding in my chest. "What is this place?" "It's a sanctuary," he said, "for people like us." The forest loomed before us, a twisted tangle of branches and shadows that seemed to whisper with every gust of wind. The air was colder here, almost unnaturally so, and I could feel the weight of something powerful pressing down on me. It wasn't like the graveyard. No voices were calling my name, no familiar spirits lurking at the edges of my vision, but it was just as unsettling. "A sanctuary?" I repeated, my voice uncertain. I had never heard of such a place, and I had never imagined that there could be a place where the living and the dead could exist side by side. Thomas nodded, his expression serious. "It's a place for people like us, people who don't quite fit in with the living or the dead. They can't get to us here, not the collectors or spirits." I stared at the forest, a knot of unease twisting in my stomach. I wanted to believe him that this place could keep us safe. But after everything that had happened, after everything I had seen, it was hard to trust anything. The dead had raised me, but they had also lied to me. The world of the living had welcomed me, but now it was hunting me. "What's in there?" I asked, my voice quiet. Thomas glanced at me, his face shadowed in the fading light. "Other people like us," he said, "people who've escaped, people who don't belong anywhere else." I looked into the darkness of the forest, my mind racing. I wasn't sure what I had expected when I escaped the graveyard. Freedom, maybe, or a chance to start over. But it hadn't taken long for me to realize that escaping one kind of darkness didn't mean you were free from all of it. Thomas stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the trees. "We should go in. It's not safe out here, not with him looking for us." I hesitated, my feet rooted to the ground. The idea of stepping into another world, another place full of secrets and dangers, terrified me. But the thought of staying out here, vulnerable and exposed, was worse. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's go." We stepped into the forest, the trees closing in around us like a living thing. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and moss, and the ground beneath my feet was soft, almost spongy. It felt like we were walking into another world untouched by time or human hands. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. The sounds of the outside world, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of life faded away, replaced by a heavy, almost oppressive silence. My heart pounded in my chest, the weight of the forest pressing down on me with every step. Thomas moved confidently through the trees, his footsteps light and sure, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He wasn't as calm as he appeared. Whatever this place was, it wasn't just a sanctuary. It was something more, something dangerous. "How did you find this place?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence. Thomas didn't turn around. "I didn't. Someone brought me here, same as I'm bringing you." I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting. "Who?" "You'll meet them soon," he said, his voice tight. "They'll explain everything." I didn't like the sound of that. I didn't like the idea of more mysteries, more questions. I had spent too long living in a world of half-truths and shadows. I wanted answers. But I also knew that pressing Thomas for details now wouldn't help. I had to trust him, at least for a little while longer. We walked for hours, the trees growing denser around us, the path winding deeper into the forest's heart. The light from the setting sun barely reached us here, and soon we were walking in near darkness. But Thomas seemed to know where he was going, and I followed him, my heart pounding in my chest, the fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached a clearing. It wasn't large, just a small, open space surrounded by trees, but there was something different about it. The air was lighter here, less oppressive, and I could see faint lights flickering in the distance, like the glow of lanterns or candles. This place had a sense of calm, a stillness I hadn't felt since leaving the graveyard. Thomas stopped at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the shadows. "We're here," he said quietly. I looked around, my breath catching in my throat. "What is this place?" "It's where we'll be safe," he said. "For now." A voice called out from the shadows before I could ask him anything else. "Thomas!" I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. A figure stepped out from between the trees, a tall, thin man dressed in dark clothing, his face hidden by the shadows of his hood. He moved with a quiet grace, his steps barely making a sound as he approached us. "Is this the boy?" the man asked, his voice low and even. Thomas nodded, his expression serious. "This is Samuel." The man's gaze shifted to me, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. His eyes were dark, almost black, and something was unsettling about how he looked at me like he could see straight through me. "You've brought him here just in time," the man said, his voice soft but commanding. "The collectors are growing more restless. They've been searching for you." I swallowed hard, the fear creeping back into my chest. "What do they want with me?" I asked, my voice shaking. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his dark eyes studying me strangely. "You're a rarity," he said finally, "a child raised by the dead but still alive. They want you because you don't belong in either world." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always known I was different, that I didn't fit in with the living or the dead, but hearing it said so plainly and coldly made it all feel more real, more dangerous. "You're not the first," the man continued, his voice quiet. "There have been others like you, others who crossed the line between life and death. The collectors are drawn to you because of that. They see you as something to be controlled." I glanced at Thomas, my heart racing. "Is that why you brought me here, to hide from them?" Thomas nodded, his expression grim. "This is the only place where they can't reach us. The forest keeps them out." I looked around at the trees, the thick canopy overhead blocking out the sky. The idea of being trapped here, even if it meant being safe from the collectors, made my stomach turn. "How long do we have to stay here?" I asked, my voice small. The man smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "As long as it takes. You're not safe outside these woods." The weight of his words pressed down on me, and I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. I had spent so long running, trying to escape the shadows of my past, but now I was trapped again in a different kind of prison. Thomas must have seen the look on my face because he stepped closer, his voice gentle. "It's not forever, Samuel, just until we figure out what to do." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed him. I had escaped the graveyard, but now it felt like I was running from something worse. The man turned, gesturing for us to follow. Come, there's much to discuss. Thomas and I followed him into the clearing, where the flickering lights grew brighter. Walking, I noticed other figures moving in the shadows, people like Thomas and me. They were quiet, watching us with cautious eyes, their faces pale and gaunt. It was clear that they didn't belong in the world outside, just like we didn't. As we approached the center of the clearing, I saw a small fire burning, its flames casting eerie shadows on the trees around us. A group of people sat around the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. They were all different, some young, some old, but they shared the same haunted look and sense of displacement. "This is the sanctuary," the man said, gesturing to the people around the fire. "It's where we gather, where we keep the things that don't belong." I felt a chill run down my spine at his words. The things that don't belong. Was that what we were? Misfits, outcasts, caught between life and death with no place to call home. The man motioned for us to sit, and Thomas and I took our places around the fire. The others watched us in silence, their eyes filled with curiosity and something else, something darker, like they were weighing our worth. The man stood at the fire's edge, his dark eyes scanning the group. "You've all been chosen," he said, his voice low and commanding. "You've all crossed the line between worlds, and now you are here. You are safe." Safe. The word hung like a promise, but I wasn't sure if I believed it. As we sat around the fire, the flames casting long shadows on the faces of the others, I couldn't shake the feeling that this place, the so-called sanctuary, was just another cage. The dead might be unable to reach us here, and the collectors couldn't step into the forest, but we were still trapped. It wasn't freedom, not really. It was just a different kind of confinement. The man who had led us here stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes dark and unreadable. He seemed to be waiting for something, perhaps for the rest of us to settle in, to accept the situation, but I couldn't accept it. Not yet. "What do you mean we've been chosen?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence that hung over the group. My words were sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. I needed answers. The man's gaze shifted to me, his expression calm, almost dispassionate. "You've been chosen because you don't belong to either world. You've crossed a line that few can ever return from." His words settled over me like a weight. I knew I had crossed a line. I had lived with the dead, been raised by them, and yet I was still alive. But I had always thought I could leave that world behind and be free. Now I wasn't so sure. "But we're not dead," I said, my voice rising with frustration. "We're alive. We don't belong to the graveyard." A murmur rippled through the group, the others shifting uncomfortably. The man's face darkened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You may be alive in body," he said slowly, "but your soul is marked by the dead. You've lived in their world. Their power has touched you. That can't be undone." The others around the fire nodded as if they understood, as if they had all accepted this fate. But I couldn't. I couldn't accept that I was forever bound to the graveyard, to the shadows that had raised me. Thomas shifted beside me, his face grim. He hadn't said much since we entered the clearing, but now I could see the weight of this place settling on him as well. He had been here before. He knew what this sanctuary meant. I turned to him, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is this it? Is this what happens now? We just stay here forever?" Thomas didn't meet my eyes. "It's not forever," he said quietly. "It's just until we find a way to stop them." "Stop who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The collectors," Thomas said, his voice tense. "They're hunting people like us, people who've escaped the boundaries between life and death. They won't stop until they have us all." The fire crackled, casting strange shadows across the clearing. The others listened in silence, their faces pale and drawn. Some looked older, their eyes filled with the weight of years spent hiding from the collectors, from whatever forces bound them to this place. "But why?" I asked, my frustration boiling over. "What do they want with us?" The man standing at the fire's edge stepped forward, his gaze cold and steady. "They want to control you, to harness your connection to both worlds. You are valuable to them, an anomaly, something that doesn't fit neatly into their understanding of life and death." His words chilled me, not just because of their meaning, but because of how he said them, so matter-of-fact, as if this was how things had always been, as if this was the way things always would be. But we're not theirs to control, I said, my voice shaking. We didn't ask for this. No, the man said, his expression softening slightly. You didn't, but that doesn't matter to them. A heavy silence fell over the group, the weight of his words pressing down on all of us. I felt sick. The dead had always been my world, but I had never realized just how deep their hold on me was. I had never thought that I could be hunted because of it. Thomas shifted beside me, his jaw clenched. We have to fight back, he said, his voice low but firm. We can't just hide here forever. The others glanced at him, some nodding in agreement, others looking away as if the idea of fighting was too much for them to bear. I couldn't blame them. The collectors, whoever they were, sounded powerful, unstoppable even. What chance did we have? The man at the fire's edge tilted his head, watching Thomas closely. Fight them? He repeated, his voice carrying a note of skepticism. You think you can fight them? Thomas met his gaze, his eyes burning with determination. We can't keep running forever. The man was silent momentarily, his eyes narrowing as he studied Thomas. You don't understand the kind of power you're up against, he said slowly. The collectors are not just men. They are forces of nature. They are as old as the boundaries they protect. I swallowed hard, my mind spinning with the implications of his words. Forces of nature, old as the boundaries they protected. This wasn't just about me or Thomas. This was about something much bigger, something that had been in place long before we were born. But Thomas didn't back down. We don't have a choice, he said. If we stay here, they'll find us eventually. Hiding isn't enough. We have to fight back. A murmur of agreement rippled through the group, though it was faint, hesitant. The others were scared. I could see it in their eyes. They had spent too long hiding, too long being hunted. They didn't know how to fight anymore. The man at the fire's edge folded his arms across his chest, his expression thoughtful. And how do you propose we fight them, Thomas? What do you think will stop them? Thomas glanced at me, his eyes filled with determination, and I knew what he would say before he opened his mouth. We need to go back, he said, to the graveyard. The clearing went silent. The others stared at Thomas in disbelief, their faces pale with fear. Even the man who had led us here looked taken aback. Back to the graveyard? One of the others whispered, her voice trembling. Are you insane? Thomas shook his head, his jaw set. No, I'm not insane. The graveyard is where it all started. It's where the connection between life and death is strongest. If we're going to fight the collectors, we need to understand what they're after, and the only way to do that is to go back. I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest. The graveyard. The place I had fought so hard to escape. The idea of going back filled me with dread. But deep down, I knew Thomas was right. We couldn't keep running forever, and the answers we needed were in the graveyard. The man at the edge of the fire was silent for a long moment, his eyes narrowed as he studied Thomas. Then, slowly, he nodded. You may be right, he said, but going back will be dangerous. The collectors will be waiting for you, and once you cross that threshold again, there's no guarantee you'll come back out. Thomas nodded, his expression grim. I know, but we have to try. I looked around at the others, their pale faces and frightened eyes. They had been running for so long, hiding in this sanctuary, hoping to escape the collectors. But there was no escape. Not really. Not unless we took the fight to them. The others began to murmur among themselves, some agreeing with Thomas, others shaking their heads in fear. But I knew what I had to do. I had been marked by the dead, bound to the graveyard in ways I still didn't understand. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep hiding. I'll go with you, I said, my voice steady. Thomas turned to me, surprise flickering, but he nodded. Are you sure? I swallowed hard, the fear swirling in my chest. Yeah, I said, I'm sure. The man at the fire's edge watched us both, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stepped forward, his gaze fixed on me. If you're returning to the graveyard, he said, you must be prepared. The collectors aren't the only danger waiting for you there. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? The graveyard is a place of power, the man said slowly. It's a gateway between life and death. And once you've crossed that threshold, the dead will know you. They'll be drawn to you. I felt a cold shiver run through me. The dead, the spirits who had raised me, who had whispered their secrets in the dark. They had always been a part of my life, but now I realized how dangerous they were. If you're going to survive, the man continued, you must understand what you are. You're not just alive, Samuel. You're something more, something in between. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Something in between. I had always known I was different, but now I was beginning to understand how different I was. Thomas glanced at me, his expression serious. We'll figure it out, he said quietly. We'll figure out what they want and how to stop them. I nodded, though my heart was pounding in my chest. The graveyard was waiting for us. The dead were waiting for us, and the collectors were hunting us. There was no turning back now. The following day, the weight of what we had decided settled over me like a heavy cloak. The fire had long since burned down to embers, and most of the others in the clearing had drifted into the shadows to rest. But I had barely slept. The thought of returning to the graveyard gnawed at me, filling my mind with questions I couldn't shake.